I am Brandon Mitchell, 39 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I walked out of my own house in Brookfield, Ohio, in the middle of a dinner party my wife, Lauren Mitchell, had organized for her colleagues from Silverline Marketing, and the worst part is that no one there seemed surprised when I did it, because by that point I'd already been shrinking inside my own home for months. I had spent the entire afternoon outside making sure everything looked perfect, scrubbing the grill grates until they shined, trimming the hedges along the fence line, sweeping the patio twice because the first time apparently was not thorough enough, and replacing the broken deck lights so the backyard would glow softly once the sun went down. I followed every instruction Lauren gave me down to the smallest detail, from how the chairs should be angled toward the fire pit to which serving platters should be used for the appetizers, because lately it felt like I was constantly auditioning for the role of acceptable husband instead of actually being one. Lauren came downstairs an hour before guests were due to arrive wearing a fitted black dress and heels that sank slightly into the grass when she stepped outside to inspect my work, and she looked like she was heading to a rooftop bar in Chicago instead of hosting coworkers in our suburban yard. She had already poured herself a large glass of wine, the kind she claims helps her unwind, but really just sharpens the edge at her voice, and she walked around the patio with her eyes scanning for flaws. When she noticed a single cushion slightly out of place, she adjusted it herself and let out a soft sigh that carried more judgment than words ever could. I ignored the tension in her tone because I had learned that any comment from me could be twisted into criticism or incompetence, and I did not have the energy for another argument about how I never quite meet her standards. As the guests began arriving, I greeted them with practiced smiles and firm handshakes, while Lauren's laughter floated across the yard, louder and brighter than it ever seemed at home when we were alone. I moved between the grill and the patio table, flipping steaks at the exact doneness she had specified, checking the temperature of the chicken twice, and refilling drinks before anyone had to ask. I listened as Lauren introduced me not as her husband, but as Brandon, like I was an accessory to the evening rather than her partner. And each time she made a small joke at my expense about how I would probably burn something if she did not supervise. The group laughed politely while I forced a grin that felt like it might crack my face. The smell of charcoal and seared meat hung heavy in the warm Ohio air, and sweat clung to my back beneath my button-down shirt. But I kept moving, kept serving, kept proving that I could be useful. At one point, I caught Lauren watching me with an expression I could not quite read, something between impatience and disappointment. And it hit me that no matter how much effort I poured into nights like this, it would never translate into respect. I felt like a stagehand in my own life, adjusting props while someone else delivered the performance, and the realization settled in my chest like a weight I could no longer ignore. As the night went on, Lauren's voice carried farther across the yard, growing sharper with every refill of her glass, and I could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere each time I opened my mouth, because her reactions were no longer playful, but edged with something meaner, something designed to remind me of my place. I told a harmless story about getting lost during a trip to New Mexico a few years ago after I misread a highway sign and ended up driving nearly 40 miles in the wrong direction, and I described the endless stretch of desert and the way the sky looked too big for the earth beneath it, trying to make it self-deprecating and light, trying to contribute to the conversation in a way that felt human. The group laughed in the right places. One of her coworkers made a joke about how Lauren must have been furious, and for a brief second, I thought maybe this would pass like any other small embarrassment. Lauren rolled her eyes so dramatically it felt rehearsed, leaned back in her chair, and said in a flat voice that carried over the crackle of the fire pit that I was clueless, and that she had to double-check everything when we traveled, because I would probably misread the airport gate and end up on the wrong plane. The words themselves were not devastating, but the tone was, because it was not affectionate teasing, it was dismissal, and it landed in the middle of the table like something heavy and final. I felt the heat rise up my neck, but I kept my expression neutral, nodding slightly as if I agreed with her assessment of me, as if this version of myself she painted was accurate. Then she laughed again, tipped her glass back for the last swallow of wine, and in one careless motion flung the empty glass in my direction like I was part of the punchline she was finishing. It was not a hard throw, not something that would leave a bruise, but it was deliberate enough to make a statement. The red wine arced through the air and splashed across the patio stones near my shoes, staining the pale grout lines dark, and the glass hit the ground with a sharp crack that cut through the low hum of conversation. It shattered at my feet, fragments skittering outward, one piece tapping against the toe of my shoe before settling. The sound echoed louder than it should have, and for a moment the only thing I could hear was the faint ringing in my ears and the distant hum of traffic from the road beyond our backyard fence. Nobody laughed. Nobody rushed to smooth it over with a joke. Nobody defended me or even looked directly at me. Her coworkers froze in place, their smiles fading into stiff, polite expressions, their eyes darting between us as if they had stumbled into something private that should not have been witnessed. Lauren did not apologize. She did not even glance down at the broken glass, as if it were an accident. She just looked at me with a tight expression, her lips pressed thin, like I had somehow ruined her evening by not being entertaining enough, not impressive enough, not invisible enough. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the wine, soaking into the stone, and the shards scattered around my shoes, and I realized how small I must have looked in that moment, holding a pair of tongs in one hand like a prop while my wife treated me like a misbehaving extra in her carefully staged event. My chest felt hollow, not explosive or furious, just emptied out, like something had finally drained away. I bent down slowly, careful not to cut myself, and started picking up the larger pieces of glass with my bare hands while the conversation awkwardly resumed behind me in lowered voices, and the only thought repeating in my mind was that I had just watched my dignity shatter at my feet, and no one, including my own wife, thought it deserved acknowledgement. I did not argue or raise my voice because I understood in that instant that any reaction from me would be twisted into further proof of whatever flaw she wanted to highlight. So instead I set the tongs down on the edge of the grill, wiped my hands slowly on a napkin, and walked past the patio table without looking at anyone, feeling their eyes follow me, but hearing no one call my name. I stepped into the house where the music still played faintly from the kitchen speaker, the contrast between the soft background playlist and the sharp crack of the shattered glass still ringing in my ears, making everything feel surreal. And I went straight to the hallway table where my keys sat in their usual place in the ceramic bowl Lauren once said was the only decent decorative piece I had ever picked out. I grabbed them, slipped on my jacket, even though it was not particularly cold, and walked back out through the garage instead of the backyard, so I would not have to cross through the scene again. The drive out of Brookfield felt longer than it should have, even though the roads were mostly empty, and the only sound inside the truck was the low hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of my own breathing as I tried to keep it even. I did not blast the radio or call anyone, or even check my phone, because I did not want to see if she had noticed I was gone or if she even cared. I drove 30 miles without any clear destination in mind until I saw the flickering neon sign of a roadside motel that looked like it had not been renovated since the late 80s. And I pulled in without hesitation, as if my body had made the decision before my mind caught up. The room cost $68 for the night, paid in cash because I did not want to explain anything to anyone or leave a digital trail that would turn into another conversation later. And the clerk handed me a key attached to a faded plastic tag with a number worn thin from years of use. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and industrial cleaner, and the bedspread had a floral pattern that clashed with the beige walls. But it was quiet, and it was neutral, and no one there knew my name. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before lying down, staring at the textured ceiling with its tiny cracks branching like thin veins. And for the first time all night, the silence pressed in hard enough that I could not ignore what I was feeling. I replayed every subtle insult from the past year with a clarity that made my chest tighten. The time she mocked my taste in furniture at a store in Dayton, when I pointed out a leather armchair I liked, and she laughed in front of the salesman and said she would never let something so outdated in her house. The way she corrected me in front of strangers about small details that did not matter, like the name of a restaurant or the year we took a trip, as if I could not be trusted to speak without supervision. I thought about the comments she made when we were alone, telling me I should let her handle conversations at networking events because I came off as awkward, suggesting that my jokes did not land the way I thought they did, hinting that I was lucky she was socially polished enough to compensate for me. Each memory felt minor when it happened, easy to brush aside as stress or miscommunication or my own oversensitivity. But laid out in sequence, they formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. I remembered how often I swallowed my responses, how I began second-guessing simple decisions like what shirt to wear or how to phrase a story, how I gradually started speaking less at gatherings because it was safer to be quiet than to risk becoming the subject of another cutting remark. Lying there in that dim motel room with the hum of the air conditioner rattling unevenly in the corner, I realized that the glass thrown at my feet was not the first act of disrespect. It was just the first one so visible and undeniable that even I could not minimize it. It was not about wine or embarrassment or one bad night. It was the physical manifestation of something that had been building quietly for months. And in that stillness I understood that I had not walked out over a broken glass. I had walked out because I could no longer pretend I did not see the cracks spreading through everything. The next morning I woke up stiff and disoriented in that narrow motel bed with sunlight forcing its way through the thin curtains. And for a few seconds I forgot where I was until the memory of red wine splashing against stone and the sound of glass breaking snapped everything back into place. My phone lay on a nightstand exactly where I had set it. And when I finally picked it up, there were no frantic missed calls from Lauren, no long messages acknowledging what had happened, No sign that she had even noticed the absence of her husband at the end of her carefully orchestrated evening. The only notifications were a handful of texts from mutual friends who had been at the party, each one phrased in that polite, detached way people use when they do not want to get involved, saying she had too much to drink and that I should give her space, that it was probably just stress from work, that these things happen and it was not worth making into something bigger than it needed to be. I read those messages slowly, feeling a dull ache settle in my chest, because even in their attempt to be neutral they had already chosen a side, framing her behavior as temporary and understandable while implying that my leaving was the dramatic part. There was still nothing from Lauren, no apology, no acknowledgement of the shattered glass, no simple message asking where I was or if I was safe. I showered in the small bathroom, where the water pressure barely held steady, and dressed in the same clothes from the night before, catching my reflection in the mirror, and noticing how tired my eyes looked, how something behind them seemed muted. When I drove back home, the sky was gray and low, and the house looked exactly the same from the outside. Neat lawn, clean siding, the kind of place that suggests stability to anyone passing by. Inside, the remnants of the party had mostly been cleared away, the patio washed down, the broken glass gone as if it had never existed, and Lauren was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone with a mug of coffee in her hand. She looked up when I walked in, not startled, not relieved, just mildly annoyed, like I had stepped out to run an errand and taken longer than expected. She told me I had overreacted and that I needed to cool off, her tone controlled and almost clinical, as if she were explaining a simple misunderstanding to a coworker rather than addressing something that had cut into the foundation of our marriage. She said I embarrassed her in front of her team by walking out without a word, that people had been asking where I went, and that it made her look unstable, and she spoke about her reputation and the impression it left more than she spoke about the wine or the glass or the way she had looked at me. When I tried to mention the actual act itself, she minimized it immediately, saying she had been joking, that she barely tossed the glass, that I was being too sensitive and reading malice where there was none. Standing there in our kitchen with the morning light filtering through the blinds, I felt something inside me go still in a way it never had before. Not explosive, not dramatic, just quiet and final. I stopped trying to find the right words to explain why it hurt. I stopped assembling arguments in my head to defend my reaction. I stopped searching her face for some hint of remorse that might soften the edges of what had happened. I realized that if I had to convince my own wife that throwing a glass at my feet in front of strangers was disrespectful, then no explanation I offered would ever be enough. From that moment, I stopped arguing. I stopped defending myself against small corrections and sideways remarks. I stopped explaining my feelings because I understood that in her version of events my feelings were always exaggerated, always inconvenient, always something to be managed rather than respected. Something inside me shut down with a quiet efficiency, like a switch flipped in a room no one else could see, and while I continued moving through the house, speaking when necessary, answering when addressed, the part of me that used to reach toward her for understanding had finally withdrawn. Over the next 2 weeks, I became calm in a way that surprised even me, not explosive or visibly wounded, but measured and deliberate, like someone who had finally stepped back from a fire and was assessing the damage instead of trying to put out the flames with bare hands. I spoke less, not out of fear but out of clarity, choosing my words carefully and offering only what was necessary, and the energy I used to spend defending myself, I redirected into quiet preparation. I opened a separate bank account at a small credit union on the other side of town during my lunch break one afternoon, sitting across from a polite young teller who had no idea she was witnessing the first concrete step of a man dismantling his marriage. I redirected my paycheck the same day, adjusting the direct deposit information without ceremony, watching the confirmation screen load, and feeling an odd sense of control return to me. At home, I moved methodically, not in a frantic way, but in the steady rhythm of someone taking inventory of his own life. I gathered my birth certificate, passport, social security card, and insurance documents from the filing cabinet in the office we rarely used, sliding them into a slim folder that I kept in the trunk of my car. I canceled shared subscriptions one by one in the evenings, streaming services, cloud storage accounts, the meal kit delivery she insisted we try, but rarely cooked, and each cancellation felt like untangling a thread that had quietly bound me to a version of normal that no longer fit. I sorted through drawers and closets under the pretense of cleaning, pulling out old photographs from before Lauren and I met, letters from my father, a watch my grandfather had given me when I turned 21, and I packed them carefully into small boxes that I transported discreetly to a rented storage unit across town. The storage facility was plain and impersonal, rows of metal doors and muted shades of gray, but when I slid the lock into place on my unit for the first time, I felt a strange relief, as if I had carved out a small space that belonged entirely to me and was beyond the reach of commentary or criticism. I did not announce any of this. I did not hint at what I was doing. I simply adjusted my routines and allowed the quiet to settle between us. Lauren began to test the silence almost immediately. She made small remarks about my forgetfulness, pointing out that I had left the cabinet slightly ajar or that I had not replaced the paper towels quickly enough. And instead of defending myself, I nodded and said she was probably right. She commented on my lack of ambition, suggesting over dinner that I seemed comfortable coasting while she carried the intellectual weight of our conversations. And instead of arguing, I agreed calmly, telling her I would reflect on that. The words felt strange leaving my mouth, not because I believed them, but because I no longer needed to correct them. The absence of reaction unsettled her more than any confrontation ever had. I could see in the way she lingered in doorways after making a remark, waiting for the spark she was used to igniting. When it did not come, when there was no raised voice, no defensive explanation, no attempt to prove my worth, she shifted in her chair or changed the subject abruptly. The tension in the house did not explode. It stretched thin and taut, like a wire pulled too tight, and I moved through each day with a composure that felt almost foreign to me. I was no longer trying to win arguments or repair her perception of me. I was simply preparing, step by step, for a version of my life where I would not need to brace myself before speaking. A few days later, I received a message from Megan, one of Lauren's coworkers who had been at the party, asking if I would be willing to meet her for coffee because she said there was something she felt I should know, and the wording alone told me that whatever it was had been weighing on her. We met at a small cafe halfway between her office and my work, a neutral place with low music and the smell of roasted beans hanging in the air, and when I walked in she already looked uneasy, fingers wrapped tightly around her cup, as if steadying herself. She did not waste time on small talk, and, after a brief acknowledgement that she hoped she was not overstepping, she told me what had happened after I walked out of my own backyard without saying a word. She said that at first there had been an awkward silence among the group, that a few people had exchanged uncomfortable looks, but instead of following me or expressing concern, Lauren had laughed lightly and brushed it off. Megan told me that Lauren said I would come crawling back like I always did, that I just needed attention, that I tended to be overly sensitive and dramatic whenever she teased me. She said Lauren rolled her eyes and poured herself another drink, joking that I would cool off and return once I realized I had nowhere else to go, and that she framed my leaving not as a reaction to humiliation, but as another example of my supposed immaturity. As Megan spoke, I felt something inside me settle with a clarity that was almost clinical, not fiery or chaotic, but precise, like a final piece clicking into place. There was no anger surging through me in that moment, no urge to defend myself or argue with the version of events Lauren had presented to her colleagues. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that what happened that night was not an impulsive mistake fueled solely by alcohol, not a momentary lapse in judgment that she regretted once the guests were gone. It was an expression of a belief she genuinely held about me, a belief that I would absorb whatever was thrown at me and then return to my position without protest. Megan's voice softened as she finished, saying she thought I deserved to know because the way it was handled afterward did not sit right with her, and I thanked her for telling me, keeping my tone even and composed. I did not ask for more details, and I did not offer my own interpretation of Lauren's behavior, because there was nothing left to interpret. The image of her laughing after I left, confident that I would come back subdued and apologetic, removed any lingering doubt I had been holding on to in the back of my mind. Driving home from that coffee shop, I felt a calm resolve settle over me, heavier than emotion, but steadier than rage. It confirmed that the disrespect was not an accident to be excused or a misunderstanding to be clarified. It was a narrative she had constructed about me and repeated often enough that she believed it without hesitation. I understood then that if I confronted her again, she would likely reshape the story, minimize what she had said, suggest that Megan misunderstood, and shift the focus back to my reaction rather than her words. I decided in that moment that I would leave without giving her another opportunity to rewrite the narrative, without another debate where my experience would be reframed as exaggeration. I would not announce it as a threat or present it as a bargaining chip. I would simply step out of the version of myself she had grown comfortable diminishing, and I would do it quietly, on my own terms, before she could turn my departure into another example of my supposed instability. The following Saturday, she moved through the house with the same brisk energy she always had when hosting, rearranging plates on the kitchen island and adjusting the flowers in a glass vase as if presentation alone could secure her place in the world. And she asked me that morning to pick up fruit and juice for another brunch with the same group of colleagues, her tone casual and expectant, as if nothing significant had shifted between us. I nodded without hesitation and grabbed my keys, listening to her list off specific details about which berries to buy and which brand of orange juice she preferred, and I left the house without correcting her assumption that I would return in an hour carrying grocery bags like I had so many times before. Instead of turning toward the supermarket, I drove in the opposite direction toward the storage facility across town, the morning light pale and steady over the quiet roads, and I felt no surge of adrenaline or panic, only a measured focus that had been building for days. When I unlocked the metal door to my unit, the sound echoed in the corridor, and inside were the boxes I had packed carefully over the past 2 weeks, labeled in small handwriting, stacked with intention rather than haste. I loaded them into the back of my truck one by one, lifting the last of my clothes, the framed photographs from before my marriage, the documents I'd set aside, the small keepsakes that had once sat unnoticed on shelves in our home. There was no chaos in the process, no last-minute scrambling, because this moment had already been decided internally long before it arrived. After securing everything in the truck, I drove back to the house for the final time with the same steady composure, pulling into the driveway as if I had simply completed an errand. The windows were open, and I could hear faint music playing inside. Lauren moving through the kitchen preparing for her guests, unaware that the script she expected to unfold that day was already dissolving. I walked inside quietly, carried nothing in my hands, and went straight upstairs to our bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the decorative pillows arranged with the precision she favored, and I placed a single envelope in the center where it would be impossible to overlook. The letter was short and direct, written the night before at the small desk in the guest room while she slept. I explained calmly that I refused to stay in a marriage where I was treated as a joke, that I would not continue participating in a dynamic where my presence served as material for public amusement or quiet dismissal. I did not accuse her or catalog every grievance, because I had no interest in debating details anymore. I simply stated that I was leaving and that I hoped she would reflect on what had led to that decision. Not as an attack, but as a reality. I stood in the bedroom for a brief moment after setting the envelope down, looking around at the space that had once felt shared and now felt like a stage set for a role I no longer recognized. Downstairs, I heard the first knock at the door and Lauren's voice lifting into its practiced warmth as she greeted her guests. I did not pause to listen. I walked back out through the garage, closed the door quietly behind me, and climbed into my truck. As more cars began pulling into the driveway and voices carried faintly through the open windows, I started the engine and drove away toward the furnished apartment I had already rented on a month-to-month lease, a small place with neutral walls and minimal furniture that required nothing from me except honesty with myself. 3 hours after I pulled into the parking lot of the furnished apartment and carried the last box inside, my phone buzzed against the bare kitchen counter, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet space, and when I saw Megan's name on the screen, I already knew the call was not casual. Her voice carried a mix of disbelief and restrained emotion as she told me that Lauren had found the letter shortly after the guests finished their first round of mimosas, and instead of taking it upstairs or reading it privately, she had stood in the middle of the living room and read it out loud to the entire group, her tone wavering between indignation and forced composure, as if she expected the words to trigger collective outrage on her behalf. Megan said that at first there had been an awkward shuffle of feet and the clinking of glasses against plates, people unsure whether to look at Lauren or at the floor, and, as the letter continued in my calm, measured language, the energy in the room shifted from sympathy to something heavier and quieter. She told me no one laughed, no one rushed to comfort Lauren in the way she might have anticipated, and that as the meaning of the letters settled over the room, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. One by one, people began to gather their coats earlier than planned, offering polite but brief excuses about prior commitments, leaving behind half-finished plates of fruit and untouched pastries on the counter. Megan said Lauren's voice cracked as she repeated that she did not think I would actually leave, that she thought I was just trying to prove a point, and that she kept circling back to the same line, as if saying enough times would undo the reality unfolding around her. As I listened, standing in a kitchen that held none of the shared memories of the house I had just left, I felt something inside me that I had not experienced in years. And it was not triumph or vindication, but an expansive quiet that felt like air finally reaching parts of my lungs that had been compressed for too long. There was no urge to correct her narrative, no impulse to defend myself through someone else's validation, because the act of leaving had already spoken more clearly than any argument I had ever made. The image of her reading the letter aloud in search of sympathy did not fill me with anger. It confirmed what I had come to understand in the weeks leading up to that morning, that she had been certain of my predictability, certain that my pattern of absorbing humiliation and returning without consequence would continue indefinitely. For the first time in years, I felt free in a way that did not depend on someone else's approval or acknowledgement. I did not leave because of one glass shattering against stone or because of a single night of embarrassment, and I did not leave to teach her a lesson or to provoke regret. I left because I finally understood that my silence carried more power than any argument I had ever attempted, but the absence of my presence would speak louder than defending my dignity ever had. She had valued me only within the boundaries of her certainty that I would never walk away. And once I removed myself from that assumption, the dynamic she relied on collapsed without resistance from me. Standing there with the phone still in my hand and the hum of the refrigerator the only background noise, I realized that freedom was not loud or dramatic. It was simply the steady recognition that I no longer needed to convince anyone of my worth in order to claim it.